All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Gwen Sigrid Morgan, and I'm the president of the INLNA. And we are so happy to be here this evening doing this joint presentation with INLUS on Western Icelanders Coast to Coast. And tonight we're featuring Minneota, Minnesota, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year, and Icelanders in Alberta. So first, though, out of the deep respect for Indigenous people of Canada and the United States, we will begin with a land acknowledgement. I'd ask you if you know the names of the Indigenous people where you are, to bring them to mind. Many Indigenous, Native American, and Métis people helped our people, the Icelandic settlers, during those early years. So today we affirm our commitment to truth and reconciliation and working to ensure North America is a safe and free place for all who come to live, work, and share stories on these great lands. Now I'll hand it over to Diane.
Hello, everyone. I'm Diane Okonski. I'm the past president of the Icelandic National League of the United States. And I also am very happy to have you joining us here this evening for our program. And a special welcome to Mark Petursson and Kathryn Rothman, who will be our presenters tonight. Before we get started, there are just a couple of things we should be aware of. The first is that the program is being recorded and will be available on the INLUS website. And secondly, between the speakers, there will be about a 10-minute window for you to ask questions. So please use the Q&A feature on Zoom and type in your questions as soon as you think of them so that we can have them ready to go within that window. All right, well, let's get started for tonight. As Gwen said, we are exploring two Icelandic settlements in North America. And first, we're going to go to Minneota, Minnesota. It was first settled by Icelanders in July of 1875. Our first speaker, Kathryn Rothman, grew up in the Minneota area and will share the story of these first settlers who came from the land of fire and ice to the flat prairie lands of southwestern Minnesota. There they have created for themselves new lives, and their descendants have benefited from that. Kathryn has spent time researching this local history and interviewing those descendants. Kathryn, welcome. I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
All right, thank you. I actually started this whole research project when I was in college, so I was young enough to be able to interview some of the settlers who came when they were very young and got some of their firsthand stories. I am related, both my parents are of Icelandic descent. Both of my grandmothers are from the Minneota area. And so we're going to introduce Minneota to you. And I'm sharing my screen here. And let's hope it all comes up the way it's supposed to. And if all else fails, we'll just go with what we've got here. Okay. So we're celebrating 150th anniversary of the settlement in this area. A kind of a big deal for us because we don't normally have a lot of celebrations that are specific to the Icelandic community. But we are welcoming people this year. And one of the questions has been, why haven't we heard of Minneota? I've been a member of some of the, Icelandic heritage groups for a long time. And I hear about Canada, Canada, Canada. And I was always raising my hand and saying, what about Minneota? And so I was given the job of representing Minnesota and Minneota. As a kid, I thought all of the Icelanders who came to North America came to Minneota. I didn't realize until much later that most people came to Canada. But I think the difference was we hear so many stories about the Icelandic immigrants in Canada because of the very, very great difficulties they experienced in the early years. The religious controversy that followed, there was a lot of talk about that. But the Minneota community didn't have that. There was not so much trauma. There were not so many stories. and they intentionally avoided the controversy. Minneota does have a celebration each year, but it's not the Deuce. It's not specific to Iceland, but rather it's Bug Days, which or if you want to give it its formal name, it's Boxelder Bugs Days, which was kind of started with Bill Holm and his Boxelder Bug Variations poetry. But we just have been quieter because we haven't had as much commotion to talk about, I guess, or as much trauma. If you're curious where Minneota is, if you look at this map, the green shaded part of Minnesota here in the southwest is 3 counties. On the top is Yellow Medicine County, then on the border is Lincoln, and then moving in towards the east is Lyon County, and that white pin dot there, that is where Minneota is located, kind of right where those 3 come together. It's prairie land for the most part, but it is enough distance away from the bigger settlements in Winnipeg and Mountain that they were somewhat separate. I worked it out, and I figured that if you were driving at speed limit by car and going to Gimli, it's going to take about 8.5 hours to drive. So you can imagine if you were going by horseback or cart or something. If you're going to go to Mountain, it's over 5 hours. But Minneapolis, it's almost 3 hours by car now. So they were somewhat isolated from some of the other communities. So why did they leave? Well, I'm a historian by training. And the one thing you learn is that people leave for 2 reasons. One is because life is impossible and they have to go. There's just no choice. The other is that there's some promise of a better life and it beckons and they want to go. But generally speaking, both things are at play when people make a move. But then the biggest question is, how should they live in the new place? To recreate the old country, to avoid interaction with other peoples, that was a choice that New Iceland made, and an attempt to kind of recreate what they had had before. It also is what happens lots of times with older immigrants who find it just too overwhelming to learn a new language and to adapt to a new place. And so they kind of cling together with the maintaining what they can. But the other choice, which was the choice that Minneota made, is they wanted to interact, to learn from the people who already had settled in this new land. They wanted to thrive, and they wanted to become a part of this new country. They could see that there was not much chance that they would be going back. A few did for visiting, but for the most part, this was a move that they would make, and this would be where their lives would be. And so they did not try to isolate or recreate Iceland. They tried to learn how to be Minnesotans, basically. So what was the difference? Well, this story really starts with Paul Thorlaksson, who in many ways I think of as kind of a Moses, who was active in most of the Icelandic communities. But he had gone to seminary at a Norwegian seminary and had become friendly with some of the Norwegian students there and had traveled with them to their hometowns. And a lot of the folks from Norway had come about 30 years earlier, and they had already established themselves in the United States. And so he observed what they had done in order to establish themselves. He then arranged for jobs for a number of Icelandic immigrants on Norwegian farms in Wisconsin, because the Icelanders could understand the Norwegians, but the Norwegians couldn't understand the Icelanders when they spoke. But they recognized that farming in Iceland, which was mostly, livestock and a little bit of other grains and foodstuffs, was very different than farming in the United States, especially in the farm prairies. So he thought it would be good for them to learn how to farm, to learn a little language, to accumulate some money and stuff before they were to go out and find their own place. And then he and a friend scouted out looking for a suitable area where an Icelandic community could thrive. And he found it in the Minneota area after checking out a number of places. where New Canada was a raw land, and some of the stuff I've read made it sound like it must have been just terrific culture shock to be coming into such a different place than the old country had been. That was a place that the Canadian government wanted settled. But the Minneota community was also an open land. It had been open because there'd been a war sometime earlier in that part, the Dakota War, that was happening during the Civil War here. And that land had been opened up. So both of them were kind of, fresh lands. But the difference was that the New Canada was really a raw land ready to settle, whereas the area that Minneota was going in was partially settled. And so there was the beginnings of some of the things that would be necessary for the community. And here's why. There was already some transportation in place. There were already some roads. The trains were going through, and some of that was already developed. There were ways to get things to market. There was enough land for Icelanders to settle on, even though they would not be all clumped together and they would be interspersed with other nationalities, that there was enough good land for them. And having Norwegians nearby, whom they could understand, turned out to be a blessing. So that was helpful. Especially, and now I'm going to have to talk about Eastern and Western settlements, because in the Minneota area, there are two kind of distinct settlements. On the east side, it is some of the best farmland there is. Rich, fertile soil, just really good stuff. When you go into the western settlement, the soil is quite different, and it made good pasture land. Like I said, this was all land that was recently available because of the Dakota Sioux War. The Yellow Medicine River was nearby. It was a water source. It's not like having the ocean or a huge lake nearby. The Icelanders were much less concerned about cultural purity and more interested in thriving, although the Western group in particular wanted to preserve the language as much as they possibly could. And they believed that they could maintain their identity through language, through traditions, through food, through storytelling, and that they would not need to be separate from other people. So it's quite a difference to go from this stuff, a turf house, the waterfalls, the water, the land that they were used to like that, to go from these deep glacial valleys here and the farms and the edge of the hills, to go from there to go to this new place, which is flat, pretty much. Just little bits of rolling land. That's pretty much it. So no sea, no mountains, no rushing glacial rivers, very different space and much hotter, seriously, and colder. Here's the Western settlement. I wish I could have gotten a better shot of this. I was standing in the cemetery at the Lincoln County Church Cemetery. You can see how the road dips down here, it kind of disappears and it appears again. These are all big windmills for producing electricity. They sit up there. A number of glaciers went through Minnesota, and it happens that the western side of Minneota, this western settlement, the land is much more rocky, thinner topsoil. It's the glaciers would scrape up stuff as they went, and so it's just different. It was more attractive to some of the settlers because it reminded them more of home. And especially those who came later when the good farmland in the east was already taken up. They ended up there, and the western settlement turned out to be the second largest Icelandic community in the United States. So that's the Lincoln County crowd. This is my great-great-grandfather, a man whose name was Styrmather, his nickname. He was unlike many of the Icelanders in that he had been a professional sailor, seaman, for about 15 years, he had been at sea. And for him to come, he missed the sea terribly. He used to say that the thing that reminded him the most of back home was when the flax was in flower and it was blue and the wind would ripple through it. And then that made him feel better. But the truth is that these are people who had been used to being near the sea. Men were used to going fishing in the wintertime. This was a shock. They were now pretty much landlocked because there are no big, water bodies near Minneota. It's just the Yellow Medicine River, and there are some lakes from here to there. I was curious, so I did a little bit of research again, just to see how far they were from the ocean. These people who normally were within walking distance, I suppose. But to get to the Pacific Ocean from Minneota, you'd have to go 22 hours and 26 minutes by car at speed limit. If you want to go to Hudson Bay, that's 1,351 miles. If you want to go to the Atlantic Ocean in New York City, between 20 and 25 hours by car. So these people used to the sea were now landlocked. And for some of them, that was a hardship. How many came to Minneota? It's really hard to say. When I did my research, I found out that at first they were counted as Danish subjects because they were Danish subjects. And so then estimates were made based on mother tongue. Approximately 1,000 Icelanders settled in Minnesota. There were a few up in the far northwest around Roseau area, not that far from Mountain, actually. A few in the Duluth area, a few in St. Paul. Some stopped there to work on their way, and there were some that returned there. The relatives I had who moved to the cities all ended up in St. Paul for some reason. When they began to arrive in 1875, Gunnlaugur Petursson was the first. And he traveled with his Norwegian neighbors. They had decided that they were going to leave Wisconsin and come out to this open land in the Minneota area. And so he decided that he would come with them. And he arrived on July 4th, 1875. In 1879, we have the 160 immigrants who all came at one time, overwhelming the population of Minneota, not having housing, being dressed for the summertime in Iceland, which required heavy wool clothing where they were from, and they were perfectly miserable. But they were able to find shelter in anything from granaries to barns to you name it until they could figure out their housing area. Most of these people came from the Vopnafjörður area in Iceland, in northeast Iceland. That's where all of my folks are from. And I don't know about yours, Diane, but I think a lot of Minneota folks grew up knowing that we were from Vopnafjörður. So at the very height of things, in the western settlement, the Lincoln County settlement, there were 55 households. And in the eastern settlement, there were 28. Most of us had family in both places. Others came from the Westman Islands, from the South Coast, from the West Coast. Kathy, Bill Holm, I should say, used to say, how come all these guys there were so many unmarried Icelanders in the Minneota area? But Kathy has been doing some of her genealogical work, and she said, so many of them came as family groupings, that all of the marriageable age people were all their first and second cousins. So there weren't really a lot of Icelandic mates to be found. And so you will find DNA, Icelandic DNA, with all sorts of last names, Belgian, French, Swedish, Norwegian, German, Italian, Dutch, you name it. So we're a rather mixed group. Originally, there were 3 churches that were established in the area. The top is the Lincoln County Church from the Western Settlement. The bottom is the Western Heim. At one time, it was called the American Church, all Lutheran churches. What was distinct about the folks out in Lincoln County was that they desperately wanted to preserve the language. That was almost their main reason for having a church there. And then worship was kind of an after thing after that. So here we are. What is Minneota now? It is a hometown for about 1,300 people. It's about 12 miles from the county seat of Marshall, so it's a bedroom community. It also remains a community of farmers. It is famous for having its own book. The Heart Can Be Found Anywhere, Minneota, Minnesota, by Bill Holm, that relates some of the stories. And the Big Store, which was at one time the biggest department store, I think, west of the Mississippi. And it's quite an impressive place. The upstairs is this huge opera house. And I used to get my 4-H project fabrics there. And of course, Bill Holm and poetry and bug days. And we're celebrating July 26th and 27th with a variety of activities at the Big Store, at the Opera House, and at St. Paul's Lutheran Church. So we're busy, we're excited, we're anticipating a good turnout and chance to celebrate our heritage. So that's what I've got, folks. And I'm ready for questions or whatever.
Well, thank you very much, Kathryn. That was very interesting. So you said that 160 Icelanders showed up in Minneota all at once and overwhelmed the housing and things like that. Do you know how big Minneota was when they arrived?
You know, at one time I had the number, but I know it was less than that. There were a number of people who had settled originally when land was available and thought they would try their hand at farming and then decided it wasn't for them. And either they went back east or else they moved into town or into Marshall and started businesses. But I know that it was at about 160 or less, the population at that time when this influx of people came. And they just didn't have any place to put them, you know, and so it was whatever keeps the rain out would have to be it.
Okay. And one of the other things, you know, the land went pretty quickly. You know,
Yeah.
the eastern settlement, the Westerheim Township and Yellow Medicine County land went very quickly because it was so fertile and so rich. The Lincoln County land was next, but then
Right.
what happened after that? Where, you know, the Icelanders didn't really have a lot of land available.
No.
So where did they
Well,
go?
some in Ivanhoe went. There was some back and forth between the North Dakota folks and even up into Canada, back and forth a little bit. People kind of did what they could. You know, having come from a land that was not fertile, they were not always the best judges of good farmland either. And so sometimes they would bypass really good stuff because they were always thinking sheep and pasture and that rather than growing grain crops and commodities and stuff like that. And so those who had the advantage of working in Wisconsin had some advantage, but it was only the very beginning when those folks were there. After that, a lot of people came directly from Iceland and had to learn from those who knew something about how to go about thriving here.
All right. One of the other questions that we've got is, did the Icelanders remain mostly farmers, or did they take up other businesses and other careers?
Like I said, some of them went into town, established businesses. The Big Store was started by businesses. There was a big cooperative mercantile that was started. You know, they were very much into that kind of thing. There was such a such an interest in education and wanting to have the kids be able to move on. And so those generations produced a lot of people who went on for more education than most folks got in those days and went into professions. But farming was still a very, very big thing, and a very close community as well. You know, we were in and out all the time because we have relatives there. And like a lot of kids who grew up in the Minneota area, we had to make the trudge. We had to go upstairs to the dentist's office, and that was kind of like this common awful experience that we all had. But yeah, they some of the other nationalities, like the Belgians who were around us, they really was sticking with farming for the most part. That was their main thing, was they wanted to have farms and develop them. But the Icelanders were open to whatever opportunity there was and to improve their lot in life. So
Do you know how many Icelanders or how many residents in Minneota today consider themselves Icelandic?
I don't know. That would be very interesting, because if you look through the list of people who will show up for something with Icelandic, the names are all over the place.
Mhm.
It's really hard to tell. And honestly, I didn't realize for a long time my great uncles would always be talking about this one or that one. And I always thought, well, that's because they're neighbors, but it turned out they were all first cousins, you know. And so the family kind of clung together. But
Mm.
I would be very curious. I know that a lot of them, as they have intermarried, have moved away into some of the other churches and stuff like that. So the Icelandic church that remains is quite small. But there are still a lot of Icelanders around in the area.
Yeah. And for our last question, Kathryn, it seems from Bill Holmes' book, it seems like there was a tight community in the by the Icelanders, and was that the case, and what kept them so close?
Well, partially it was family relationships. Farmly, partially it was common culture and language. I think if you were growing up when I did, you know, I heard the language spoken all the time. That was just a part of it. I think part of it was too that they had to take care of each other on the way over. They talk about how a lot of young women traveled the Vinnukonas, traveled alone, and the other Icelanders would really kind of gather around and protect them, take care of them. They relied on each other a lot for a lot of things. And so I think that helped keep the community together. And you know, it's such a small ethnic group that there's something about identity and maintaining that too. And so I'm sure that was a part of it. I know the Minneota people used to go into the cities for the Hecla Club and get together with folks from all over the upper Midwest, Minneota and Minnesota in particular, to maintain those ties with the old country and with each other. I'm always amazed how many Icelanders go back to Iceland. Even in my own family, we were talking the other day, all of my cousins that are going and their kids who are going. It's kind of like this pilgrimage everybody is making. And it's not just because it's the trendy tourist place to go, but they want to know who they are.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Kathryn. And Gwen, do you want to introduce us to Mark?
Thank you, Kathryn. I found that really, really enjoyable because learning more about Minneota. I just heard the name, but didn't know the story. So I really appreciated that. And now I'd like to introduce Mark Petursson. Mark is the president of the Leet Eriksson Icelandic Club of Calgary, and he's vice president of our Icelandic National League of North America. Mark will be I think it's a fourth generation board member of the INLNA, because his great uncle, I think I got it right, was the first president, and his grandfather was also a president of the INLNA. Mark speaks some Icelandic. So he's great to have in our group, and he loves visiting his cousins. But today he's going to tell us a little bit about the Icelanders who came to Alberta. And a lot of us know the story about the people who came to Markerville. But we don't know the story of the other people who went elsewhere in Alberta and came into the city. So today, Mark is going to share this story with us, where the Icelanders went. And today, the bond with their Icelandic heritage remains strong. And Calgary and Edmonton remain bastions of Icelandic heritage. So Mark is going to fill us in on the broader story. Take it away, Mark.
Thank you very much. I'll just pop my screen open here. There you go. I'm assuming everybody can see that now. And I'm going to move the Zoom people out of the way. There you go. So as Gwen said, I'm Mark Petursson. Ég heiti Mark Petursson. Ég frá Calgary og það gaman að tala við þig í kvöld. So that'll be it. I won't say any more Icelandic, probably. I might lie. And I just said it's going to be fun to talk with you tonight. And that I'm from Calgary. You might have heard that in there. Anyways, on the opening slide here, you can see I had some fun. I was drawing just little pictures on Google Earth.
Mark, we don't see your slides.
Oh, really? Hang on a second. Oh yeah, I see that. It says it doesn't see the slides. And let me try figuring out what's going on. I bet you I did not hit the share button. I opened up the slide properly and I did not hit the share button. If you hit the share button, I bet you it works a whole lot better.
There you go. We got you.
What do you see? Do you see the map of the world? Very good. I see you nodding, Diane. Thank you very much. So I am a technical geek, but not enough of a technical geek. So anyways, I had some fun just drawing a picture, seeing how did the Icelanders get here. And actually what I did is I had, when Stefan Stephenson was coming over, I had him put record on his Apple Watch, and this is the path that he took. So I'm going to talk about the Icelanders who came to Alberta, and as Gwen said, predominantly I'm focusing on to Calgary. I have a little comment about Edmonton, but having said that, in order to tell that story, the only way to tell that story is to talk about Markerville, because and we'll get into it. The almost nobody came just to Calgary, so the story definitely has to talk a bit about Markerville. I have just interesting my sources that I used for investigating this. There's a book, and I put the copy of it there, and this was written in 1911, published in 1911, and it's an almanac by Olafur Thorgeirsson. What I find fascinating is the story is focusing a lot on settling in Calgary and Markerville area around 1885, 1890, and this is written in 20 years later. So it's at the time that it was written, it was not a history book at all, because it was writing about events that had only happened 20 years before. You can see how it's marked up there. There's blue dots along the bottom. That's what happens if you type a word into the search engine. So this is an Icelandic website, and I just typed in Calgary, and it tells me everywhere in the document that Calgary is referenced. I did the same thing with a few other areas and was looking around. It's a very interesting book. I have to thank Ryan Aoford for supplying this to me. I also used a book that was written in 67 or published in 67, The Icelanders in Canada, by the Judge Lindahl. I took a picture of the book and the front cover, the inside cover, where it's signed by the author and given to my grandfather. So this was taken from my grandfather's library. All of the good books, my grandfather's library, are now Mark's library. So it's an interesting thing. Okay. Another source that I had was just local people. A document on the history from Margaret, a document that we believe, and I sort of have a copy of it on the right-hand side of the screen, and at the bottom it talks about that Stephen Benedictson, who is SGS's Stefan Gus Stefansson's grandson, found this article in his mother's papers, and he typed it, and then he sent its articles by so-and-so, and he recalled that it was written by Jonas Hundford. So basically, this is the same document that I was using that Ryan had given me. Having said, but it was translated by somebody, not only Google, it was also reviewed with Google, but it was translated, and some of the ways that it was translated, a lot more colorful and fun to read than the stuff I had been looking at. So I also got a compilation of interesting data from Kathryn, and some of that is in here as well. I went and I just took a look. I said, what did Canada look like when the people were coming over here? And on the far left of your screen, you can see what it looked like in 1873, and it was quite barren. And on the far right, 1949, it's a complete version. Newfoundland would have just joined the nation, and so it was a complete country. You can see 1903, around when a lot of the Icelanders were coming over, the second and third wave anyways. Alberta is complete. It's in its present configuration. Manitoba and Ontario and Quebec are still incomplete, but Alberta was complete. So why North America? So I don't have to go into too much detail on this because Kathryn did a great job talking about it. One of the interesting details that showed up in some of the research I did, though, was that one of the reasons they came to North America was really good recruitment. The Canadian government and the Icelanders who had already come were heavily recruiting to get more. Interestingly enough, at the same time as they came to North America, there were some that went to Brazil. And if the recruitment here hadn't been so powerful, then maybe we would be presenting this in Portuguese. So it's an interesting thing that there's all sorts of other things that, again, Kathryn covered very well, so I'm not going to get into it. But there were reasons why leaving Iceland was a very good idea. There were reasons why North America was a good idea, but some of them were just straight salesmanship. So why did they go to Alberta? The main reason to leave the prairies, the good land, was already taken. So I heard some comments about that in the Minneota region. They were running out of land. Where did they go? And some of them went to Alberta. The migrations came from Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, Manitoba. Interestingly enough, I didn't put it on the slide here, but the religious conflicts was also listed as one of the reasons why some of the people headed off. And in a couple of the documents, that 1911 document, by the way, it was written in Icelandic. I would read it as far as I could in Icelandic, and there would be some words I couldn't get and understand. One of the words I couldn't really understand, but Google told me what it was, is heathen. So some of the heathens were the ones that came to Alberta. So there you go. So the religious problems they were having, they got rid of the heathens and sent them out to Alberta. So I kind of giggled when I saw that, being a good Manitoba heathen myself, you see. And then one of the reasons, again, why they headed to the west, and why they headed to the west at the time that they did. Why did they pick, 1888, 1887 to be heading west? And one of the main reasons, I think, and it doesn't actually say it in the document, but the timing can't be too coincidental. The train didn't exist to get them to Calgary until the first train that connected Winnipeg to St. Paul was 1878. They didn't go east really of Winnipeg. It went down to St. Paul, and then it went east. In 1883, it was connected to Calgary, but that was for shipping supplies. There were no passengers allowed. And then in 1886, sorry, 1885, it was connected to Montreal. Again, that's through St. Paul, but over to Montreal. And in 1886, it finally started making regular passenger service to Calgary. 1887, it finally made it all the way to Vancouver. So, and then you'll see coming up, the timing is such that when they finally opened that up, then people started moving out here. And it really makes a lot of sense to try and get from North Dakota to Alberta before the train was there would have been problematic. So where is Alberta? Because I know that I'm talking to some Americans who might not know. I'm talking to, I think most Canadians probably know. But anyways, so Alberta is quite a ways away from Manitoba if you're traveling by anything other than a train or a plane, nowadays automobile. And where is Calgary and Markerville and Edmonton? You can see the map of Alberta there. Calgary's at the bottom of the three. Markerville's almost in the middle, and Edmonton is farther north. Okay, so the path to Alberta. So in March 1888, there was a meeting in North Dakota. They decided that they were going to, 30 people attended. They decided that it was time to start heading out, but they didn't want to just hop on a train and go, so they decided to send somebody out to take a look. And Sigurd Bjornsson was the guy that they picked. So I couldn't find a picture of him, by the way, but he was selected to travel to the West Coast and do the scouting. He was asked to find a spot that was good land with useful lakes and rivers where it would be expected that raising of stock and fishing would succeed. So I love the instructions he was given. It was not, they were not even thinking about Alberta at that time, though. At that time, they wanted to hit the West Coast. So they wanted to go to the ocean and the mountains. And so his goal was to hit the mountains, and that's what he did. Again, the timing is right, so that the train had just finally made it so he could make it to Vancouver. And that's what he did. He went off to Vancouver. But he was unsuccessful in finding any place on the West Coast, similar to what was happening in the prairies. All the good stuff was already gone. The people that wanted to get there had already gotten there, and there was nothing left for the Icelanders to come in. The Icelanders did not have a lot of money. I forgot to mention, by the way, one of the other reasons why they wanted to leave the prairies and head to the even Alberta was just the climate. I think I talk about that in a minute. On the way back from the West Coast, after being quite depressed about it, by the way, he went all as far as Vancouver Island, all the way from what's now Victoria up to what's now Nanaimo. And so he did a lot of research. But on the way back, he stopped in Calgary and he met Olafur Goodman. Olafur talked to him about the area called Petursson, which is now Markerville. And they toured the area with Sigfús Goodman, who was Olafur's younger brother. And on the tour, what he describes is it had favorable soil for farming, abundant fish and water, feed for livestock, conditions that appealed to the Icelanders' self-sufficiency and the desire to be isolated. So sounded like a good spot. And township, while he was there, he put down the payment to get township 36 ranges 1 and 2. So they were set aside for the Icelandic immigrants. I've circled that in red up in the corner. You can see, if you take a look, there's a 36 on the far left and a 1 and 2 going across the middle. So right where the words Red Deer, just above the words Red Deer, it says Markerville and Petursson. So that's where they went because that's the money he put down. So the first wave, when he was on his way back, he went down to Calgary and then he was going to hop on the train, but he sent a letter back first and he let them know an update of his trip, the unsuccessful time on the island and in Vancouver, and he described the Markerville area. And a bunch of the people, based on that letter, sold everything they owned before he got back. So they were packed and ready to go, which is pretty impressive. So May the 4th, 1888, so Star Wars Day, 1888, they took off and got on the train up to Winnipeg, spent a couple of days in Winnipeg. They bought supplies. They knew they couldn't take food across the border even then. So they got rid of all their food, got to Winnipeg. There was a town just across the border. They bought food. They had heard everything in Calgary. It was a boom town. Everything in Calgary was way too expensive to buy. So they bought a bunch of stuff. Ended up being a bad idea because the cost of the materials was less, but then they had to pay to ship it with them. So they end up paying more money than they should have. So the Icelanders are pretty smart, but they weren't always that smart. So they had the secondhand wagons, 3 and 4 teams horse, but they got to Calgary June 1st, and they immediately started heading north as soon as they had finished packing everything up and got some horses, but it was a very wet year. The river was flooding. It took 6 days to get the 100 miles. Everything was soaked. They were trying to sleep at night. They were soaked right through the bone. There's lots of talking about that in there. I drove there on Saturday for a thing. It only took an hour and a half, but now, by the way, and I didn't get wet at all, even though it was pouring rain. They ended up on the Red Deer River, and they were stuck because the river was flooding and they couldn't get across, and they had to get across. Their land was just on the far side. So they had brought with them a bunch of lumber for building homes, and they built a flat bottom boat, and they used the boat to get across. Worked quite well. They did lose a couple of horses though, but it's pretty impressive they did it all. So then they had to try and grow this community. And the Stefan Stephenson, he arrived in 89. He became a spiritual leader. He promoted mixed farming. So don't just do one crop. Don't just do farming of wheat. The North-South Railroad was supposed to pass through this land that they had gotten, which is one of the other reasons they had it, because that would have greatly increased their value, but it didn't. The next year, the weather turned dry and they went into drought conditions, so then nothing would grow, so it got worse. And a whole bunch of the settlers ended up leaving in 1992 because they just couldn't make it. That's part of where the people come to Calgary and Edmonton, but not completely. A bunch of them bailed and went back to Manitoba and North Dakota. But those that remained kept the whole area, including North and South, alive. I could do an entire webinar just on all the things that happened in those 2 sections of land around Markerville. It would be a great story. It would take me much more time than one half of one webinar could do. I think it's fascinating. And that's not part of my topic, so I'm going to leave that alone. But if you're ever interested, I can really point you in directions of great stuff to take a look at. A real brief note about Edmonton. The story of Edmonton and the story of Calgary are basically completely parallel. Telling you the story of how things happened going to Calgary, it's almost a complete parallel path to Edmonton. One of the interesting things, though, the first Icelanders to move to Edmonton were a guy named Carl Sigurdsson. He didn't stay there very long, though. He ended up going up to Fort Mac. He was the first European to go to Fort McMurray. And then Jon Jonsson, now there's an Icelandic name, and he's referred to as one of the fathers of Edmonton. And in Edmonton, he started real estate, and he ended up being very large in the real estate business, and is, like I say, he's now referred to as one of the fathers of Edmonton. One thing that's quite interesting about going up north to Edmonton is these guys didn't go up there until 1904. So while I say it's similar to Calgary, the timing is quite a bit different. Calgary happened in the 80s, and it wasn't until 1904 that these 2 guys headed up to Edmonton. The railroad was completed up there in '89, so it wasn't because the railroad wasn't there. But the Icelandic Club of Edmonton was organized in 1933, and changed names in '56 and 2005. But and they said a big surge of Icelandic people descent moved there after World War II. And it doesn't say anywhere why that would have triggered them to go there, but lots of them did. And as of 2016, the census in 2016, there are 4,040 people of Icelandic ancestry or claiming to be of Icelandic ancestry in Edmonton. So that's an interesting number. So now in Calgary, this looks like a nice place to live, eh? The first recorded person was Olafur Goodman. I'd mentioned him before. The second was a guy named Finnur, and he went to Calgary from North Dakota in 1981, and then he went up to Markerville, and in 93, and then back to Calgary in 97. So he actually did spend, he is one of the only guys I could find that actually seemed to go to Calgary as his target goal and then went up to Markerville later. A couple of the other guys, Peter Johansson, Edward Anderson, and they were like many others. They predominantly came down and worked in the big city because they could get work in the big city. So these guys, all of them came from Markerville area, except for Finnur, and they would go to the big city just to find work. They would come in, some of them would work as stonemasons. Some of them would go and work out in the mountains cutting trees, which I find comical, coming from Iceland and then going to become a tree cutter. And we had a guy that built one of the first breweries, which is always cool. Guðmundur, he traveled to the Canadian. This is a good-looking guy. He typically went to North Dakota first, and then he went to Calgary. Then he back to Markerville and back to Calgary. There are stories about these guys, but most of them, it's the exact same story, just over and over again. They would end up in Markerville. They would buy a farm. The wives would look after the farm while they go to Calgary to work. And then eventually they came down to Calgary. In the '67 book, The Icelanders in Canada, there are a bunch of other people mentioned in there, the doctors and businessmen. One of the great ones, Anne Ruth Lindahl, and which is amazing. She just passed away last year. I seriously wish I had written this like 3 years ago, and I would have gone to talk to her because she passed away in Calgary. I did talk to some of the club members, and they knew her, and she was the most elegant woman they had ever met. Sigurður Sigurdsson, he came to Canada in 1904. He came straight to Calgary, started up a furniture business, and had the largest furniture business in Canada. Laura Salverson, this is a picture of Salverson House in Calgary. It just sold a month ago. It was resold. It's a beautiful house. She spent time in Calgary. It's not high on the list of her accomplishments, but she has a house named after her. I don't. The connections between the Icelandic people back then were still very strong. The Jónsdóttir was Stefansson's wife, widow. Eleanor, the bottom lady here, she was the widow of the man that wrote the Icelandic national song. Drawing a blank there. So there were threats to maintaining the culture, though. And that's where, despite the efforts, the big cities is where the work was. They were leaving to their wives to tend the house and the farm. There was a lot of increased intermarriage in ethnic groups. Improved transportation, communication led to general, but even with all that, the people were moving to Calgary. The Icelandic heritage was being lost somewhat by those people, almost just straight through dilution, and yet we're still here. which is rather fascinating. But that's the real main driver. People go where the work is, and that's what brought them there. So, but we're still here, even with that dilution and the people leaving the area that they had wanted to stay at in order to keep it alive. So Markerville's still here. In 1971, this is starting to get like more recent history, but young people watching this, it'll be history. There were two newcomers from Iceland, a couple of women, and they went through the phone book looking for people with Icelandic names, called them up, and they ended up with 50 people showing up and saying, hey, we should start a club. The first club was started in 73, the only club. So that's 50 years ago, 2 years ago. So 52 years this year. And the first executive. I tried looking up all these people on Icelandic roots. I found some of them. I was going to see if there are people still living here, because I don't think there are. None of their family is still around. But we do have a very active club in Calgary. That's a picture of it. You're all welcome to come and visit at any time. It's a Scandinavian center. So we have Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and we have a very good library and a couple of very active librarians that have now digitized our entire library. We hold a whole bunch of events. This year we had a Boladagur event. We have Icelandic lessons. We have Christmas parties, Yule parties. We have spring teas. We do all sorts of stuff. Seniors lunches. So we're not just maintaining the culture in Calgary. We're still continuing to import it. There's 7,600 people in Calgary, but we have a small fraction of that actually show up. But 40% of the people that are in our club came from Manitoba. They weren't from here. Only 15% of the people actually were born in Calgary. So we're not doing a very good job of keeping people in the club. We're importing them from others. I'm one of the 40%, by the way. I also asked, this is a poll that I did about a month ago, by the way. So this is pretty fresh data, and I'm not a pollster. But 54% of our club is people born in the 1950s, which means you're 65 to 75 years old, basically. By the way, I'm part of that demographic as well. And just for fun, I asked how many grandparents did you have? So 41% of the people had 2 Icelandic grandparents. 29% had 4. I'm one of those. 23% had 1, and that little slide says 3. I don't know how many percent that is. So that's all I have for you today. I don't know that I've really enlightened you as to why people are in Calgary, except for you go where the work is. Also, you go where your wife's family is. That happened a bit. So but again, there all these stories mostly highlight the Markerville, and then they all highlight the fact that something went wrong and everybody left Markerville, and a lot of them came to Calgary. So I did have a whole bunch of fun, though. If anybody ever wants to look up the people in the book, I've got the Icelandic Roots numbers for a whole bunch of them here. I want to thank Icelandic Roots, by the way, that it was an awful lot of fun being able to look up and see how I'm related to all these people and how they're all doing. So that's all I got.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was like really fascinating. I think what you said, like developing that theme when people moved to where the work was. One thing just a couple of questions, because this is a great and thorough talk. But did the government play a role in the early settlement of Alberta? It seems, I know it played a very big role in Gimli, but it seems like it was much more free movement of people later.
Yeah, I didn't see anything in the writings that I had that commented about the government being involved at all.
Yeah.
For some reason, they got their train tickets to Calgary at half price. Maybe that's highlighted in there. $17.86 was the cost of the train ticket per person to get from Winnipeg to Calgary. So
Yeah,
that was half price. But no, I didn't see anything. It's a
Yeah.
great question. I will look that one up.
Yeah.
Any answer I don't have right now, I'll look it up and I'll get back to you.
Yeah, that's great. And the Icelanders, it seems you've got really, I'm surprised at the number that identify with as Icelandic. Did
Yes.
many of them come after World War II, do you think? Or are they just moving from other places in Canada and United States?
Uh, that is not part of the government survey that I
Yeah,
found,
yeah,
but it would be interesting to see that it should be. I should be able to find out. Maybe I can't. I'll dig back into the survey some more, or into the yeah, the not the survey. It's the census. It's the
yeah,
2016
yeah,
Canadian census that has that data.
yeah,
One of the things that though is intriguing about it is if there are that many, so like 7,000 of them here. There's 20,000 in Alberta total. So it's 7,000 in Calgary, 4,000 in Edmonton, rough numbers. So there's got to be a bunch in rural Alberta as well. Of course, Markerville has some.
yeah,
But if they're there, and that those two ladies in Calgary that were from Iceland that did the research in the phone
yeah,
book and then just started contacting people,
yeah,
there's no reason why I can't do that too. So,
yeah.
and it's not the phone book, but I can use Icelandic roots and
Uh-huh,
I can start looking for, okay, who's in Calgary,
yeah.
and then I can look and try to find them on Facebook. So I have found some people like that actually during this research, and I sent them messages. They never replied. I think the creepy old man. I don't.
Thank you very much, Mark. No, it was really fascinating to learn about the movement afterwards because we do hear a lot about Markerville, and it's great to hear about what happened in Edmonton, the development also of the club there, and this, fairly recent, the club in
Yeah.
Calgary, but how strong it really is with the other
Mhm.
Scandinavians. So I want to thank you, Mark, and I want to thank everyone here for attending. And I'll just share just a few events that INLNA is looking forward to over the next little while. Then I'll hand it back to Diane. Lots of celebrations, of course, like Kathryn told us about Minneota's 150th. Icelandic Heckler Club is celebrating its 100th anniversary. It's had lots of celebrations continuing over the summer and into the fall. Lots on their website. And of course, Gimli, Icelandic Canadian Club, is very excited. They're also celebrating its 150th, and it's joining with the Icelandic Festival in August. For 4 days of packed fun. And most exciting, the festival will be attended by Her Excellency Hala Thomasdottir, the president of Iceland. So I plan to actually head to Mountain to start celebrating there, which is my first time to that festival, and head on up to Gimli. So looking forward to seeing people there. Come up and say hello. Just want to say our 2026 INL and a calendar will be out. We for the festival at the end of the beginning of August, and it's called Influencers. And it's looking at some really prominent American and Canadian Icelandic people of Icelandic heritage who've really made their mark on North American society. And it's really fun learning about the legacy of the Icelandic settlers. So it's really fascinating. So that's what we're concentrating on. We're going to do a September webinar on September 30th on the theme of reconciliation and what it means for the descendants of Icelandic immigrants in Manitoba and the Dakotas, given the closeness with our communities during settlement and Indigenous local groups. And then INLNA Reads has their books chosen. We're going to kick off September with Eliza Reed's new mystery, Death on the Island, just in time for the joint INLNA INL US webinar, where we will be hosting Eliza Reed. That'll be on October 6th. And you can find out more details on the websites. So I'll hand it over to Diane and on behalf of the INLNA saying thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Mark and Kathryn, again for your time tonight and for the great presentations. I know we're just a little short on time, so I'm going to just highlight a couple of things. I echo what Gwen has said about getting out and enjoying all the festivals and activities that are going on in your local areas. There's lots of them going on this summer. There's a lot of ways to get involved and to make new friends and meet new people. I would like to let everyone know that you're welcome to join us on Tuesday, July 22nd. We will have the 2024 Fulbright Scholar, Aaron Kennedy, talk with us about his work in the West Fjord this past winter. He was there doing research on the weather in Iceland. And he had a great time doing his research, but he also really fell in love with the people in the location. So this is going to be a really interesting webinar in which he'll share all of that with us. As Kathryn said, Minneota's got its 150th anniversary, July 26th and 27th. The INLUS is planning an August webinar on the film The Day Iceland Stood Still with film producer Pam Hogan and hopefully Hrapa Gunnarsdóttir, who was the director of the film, which was released about a year ago and has had worldwide success. And they're going to share some exciting news with us. And as Gwen mentioned, we have a webinar with Eliza Reed coming up in October. And also, I would just like to put in a plug for the Njals Saga Tapestry. If it's coming to an area near you, please go see it. It's been displayed to raving reviews in several locations in the Pacific Northwest already. And there are stops in Alberta in July, and then the tapestry will be coming to the Deuce of August in Mountain. And then to other locations in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota during August. Minneapolis stop is August 15th through the 19th. The tapestry will be in Colorado in September, and they're working on a stop in Washington, D.C. in October. So details of the current schedule can be found on the latest INLUS newsletter. And so with that, I want to thank everyone for being here, giving us your time this evening. And thank you again to Gwen and to Mark and to Kathryn for helping put on just a wonderful presentation. And thank you all for attending. Good night.